I can say to my new Samsung Galaxy S25 Ultra, hey, find a keto-friendly restaurant nearby and text it to Beth and Steve. And it does, without me lifting a finger. So I can get in more squats anywhere I can. 1, 2, 3.
Will that be cash or credit?
Credit. 4.
Galaxy S25 Ultra, the AI companion that does the heavy lifting so you can do you. Get yours at Samsung.com. Compatible with select apps. Requires Google Gemini account. Results may vary based on input. Check responses for accuracy.
Today on CityCast DC. DC is waiting with bated breath for the House of Representatives to return to session on Monday and decide the fate of DC's budget. Now, depending on what they decide, DC could potentially see a $1 billion hit right away. The Washington Post's Jenny Gathright is here to explain how DC leaders are trying to convince the House to vote their way. Today's Wednesday, March 19th. I'm Bridget Todd, and here's what DC is talking about. Jenny, thanks for being here, especially given that so much has happened over the past week with DC's budget and Congress. It has been a little hard to follow. It's kind of head-spinning. Can you get me up to speed on what's happened in the last week in under a minute?
Thanks for having me, Bridget, and I will try. So this whole budget drama got kicked off the weekend before last when the House of Representatives, led by the GOP, unveiled a continuing resolution, which is basically a stopgap short-term budget bill that excluded this very routine provision that typically applies to DC. That provision basically allows the city to keep spending at its current fiscal year budget levels, even as the continuing resolution pauses and keeps federal agencies at their in this case, fiscal year 2024 budget levels. Basically, omitting that provision effectively proposed a $1 billion cut to DC's local budget that would have to be enacted over the next 6 months. It came as a total surprise to DC officials and residents. These continuing resolutions have included this routine language for the last 20 years, so it kind of came out of nowhere. That kicked off basically a week of intense lobbying on the Hill from DC residents and from DC Mayor Muriel Bowser and her team. So the continuing resolution passed the House along party lines, and then it moved to the Senate, where DC residents knocked on the doors of offices basically all week demanding that this provision be put back in. What ended up happening was that the Senate did pass the continuing resolution, which basically forced these budget cuts. But at the same time, right after that, they unanimously passed a separate standalone bill that would correct the problem for DC's budget. So now that standalone bill awaits passage in the House. And if it's passed in the House, then it will go into law, and this whole budget crisis for DC will be resolved.
So first of all, good job. You did that very quickly, very succinctly.
Hopefully that was clear.
So do we have a sense of whether it will pass?
We don't 100% know at this point, but some signals have given DC officials reason to be optimistic. Namely, President Donald Trump has said that he supports this standalone bill to correct the DC budget problem. And also Senator Susan Collins, who's the Republican who introduced the standalone bill in the Senate, also said that the chair of House Appropriations Committee supports it as well. And those are two really key people who support, could rally Republicans in the House to support it. And you need Republicans in the House in order for this to pass because the House is controlled by the GOP.
So DC leaders are feeling pretty okay about the likelihood that the House is going to pass this bill preventing DC budget cuts.
I mean, I would say cautious optimism. I mean, yesterday, Mayor Bowser held a press conference where she said, we're definitely pulling out all the stops. She said, I think she used the phrase, leaving no stone unturned in terms of lobbying the House to make sure that this passes. I don't think they're going to count their chickens before they hatch in this case.
So right now, technically, DC is meant to be operating with this tighter budget that's $1 billion smaller, right? What does this mean on a practical, everyday kind of level?
So far, on a practical, everyday level, nothing changes. At the press conference, Mayor Bowser and the city's CFO, the city's independent chief financial officer, Glenn Lee, both said that essentially the city is going to keep spending at its fiscal year 2020 5 levels, and that's okay for now. Basically, the omission of the provision means that DC cannot spend more than what was allocated in fiscal year 2024, which is $1 billion less than this year. But we're nowhere close to reaching that cap because we're only 6 months through the fiscal year. So the city is going to keep spending at its current levels as they wait and hope the resolution passes in the House and this problem goes away. They have contingency plans, they say, in the event that it does not pass the House and they need to make those cuts, but they're not going to make them right away because they don't necessarily have to yet.
After the Fact, a podcast by Pew, keeps it real with data-driven insights on today's big issues. No spin, just facts, mixed with stories from experts, policymakers, and people making a difference. Whether you're into the research or the personal stories behind it, we've got you covered. So what are you waiting for? Listen to After the Fact wherever you get your podcasts. Now selling. The Sydney brings 48 boutique condominiums to DC's Union Market District, where modern living meets unbeatable convenience. Tour our 2 new model homes and experience these stunning residences. Choose from 1 bedrooms starting in the low 300s, 1 bedroom plus dens from the low 400s, and 2 bedrooms from the low 500s, plus secure garage parking. Situated on Florida Avenue Northeast, the Sydney offers prime access to H Street's dining, nightlife, and Union Market's artisanal shops, all with easy metro access. Visit thesydneydc.com to schedule your tour today.
This episode is sponsored by Babbel. Are you holding back on foreign travel plans this year because you're afraid of the language gap? I'm not, because I have Babbel. I'm David Plotz, the CEO of CityCast, and I'm learning Spanish on Babbel, getting ready for a trip to Mexico City. Babbel is the language learning app that gets you talking. Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons, handcrafted by over 200 language experts, get you to begin speaking your new language in 3 weeks or at whatever pace you choose. Babbel's tips and tools are inspired by the real-life stuff you actually need when communicating. With a focus on conversation, you'll be ready to talk wherever you go. Babbel has given me great lessons on getting directions, ordering in a restaurant, and making plans. And of all the things I'm doing in Mexico City, I'm probably most excited about the soccer game we're going to. So I was excited to learn how to cheer from Babbel. That'll be me you'll hear yelling, "Fuerza Tigres! Fuerza Tigres!" With over 16 million subscriptions sold, Babbel's 14 award-winning language courses are backed by a 20-day money-back guarantee. Let's get more of you talking in a new language. Babbel is gifting our listeners 60% off subscriptions at babbel.com/citycast. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/citycast. Spelled BABBEL.com/citycast. Babbel.com/citycast. Rules and restrictions may apply.
So a lot of the folks in DC, myself included, are feeling frustrated and helpless. You've got council members saying, oh, just call another state senator or elected official, which feels kind of silly. I mean, we did not put them into office. They don't work for us. Are you hearing or seeing a similar kind of frustration from the folks that you're talking to?
Yes, to a certain extent, although I will say that last week I spent every single day on the Hill, and most of the reporting I did was with regular, ordinary DC residents who showed up to Capitol Hill, on the beginning of the week, the House, and then as the week went on, the Senate. And they were just going into the offices of senators and making their case. And I will say I did see a shift as the week went on, where at the beginning of the week, it did not seem like the staffers they were encountering really had any idea of what they were talking about. By the end of the week, the staffers who were at the front desks of these senators' offices were like, we've seen a lot of folks from DC, and we know what you're describing. We know exactly the problem that you're here to raise. And so I think that feeling and seeing that really did, on some level, empower DC residents, even amidst this sort of broader context in which they felt, completely like they were not represented in Congress. Like the reason they were there was such an indignity to start with. And yeah, and they shared with me the same thing, that they were told, go call your senator, even though, they don't have one who can vote. So I think there was that kind of dichotomy, I guess, between feeling, really disenfranchised and at the same time feeling like the sort of the power of these hundreds and hundreds of DC residents, visiting offices and then even more calling senators, feeling like that on some level had to have made a difference, because by the end of the week, you had unanimous support in the Senate for this bill creating a fix for DC.
Well, I want to talk more about that because, as you said, DC, we were lobbying House leaders hard last week before they passed the CR and sent it on to the Senate. And the House pretty much ignored those folks. So when people like Bowser are signaling that they're cautiously optimistic, I wonder, what makes Bowser so sure that this time they will hear her?
I mean, I don't think she said she's 100% sure, but I think they've had more days to try to convey their message, and also Republican senators' support. And I think that she says that counts for something. And clearly, if the president and the chair of House Approps are signaling their support for this, I think that's where she's deriving that confidence, and that support wasn't there before. So I think that's been the change.
Is it true that even the Washington Commanders sent a representative to lobby alongside DC leaders and residents?
It is true. I mean, you had residents. You also had, the business community of DC, including the team who were making their voices heard on the Hill and kind of rallying behind the city. So it really was coming from a lot of different angles.
Why would the Commanders be involved?
I think probably for a few reasons, but I mean, one significant one is, when Mayor Bowser was asked whether this potential $1 billion cut to the city budget would affect future capital investments, including potential investments to develop RFK, where, again, she hopes to lure the Commanders and bring an NFL stadium. She said that the cuts would necessitate, the phrase she used was, a pause in investments in how we grow. So that was sort of signaling that this budget cut could affect the capital budget, which is the pot of funds that the city would potentially be drawing from in order to help finance a stadium.
And when you think about that, if DC is forced to shrink its budget in that way, what kinds of services are we talking about that might get cut?
So Bowser and other city officials have said that they would have to, because they would have to make the cuts so quickly over just the second half of a fiscal year and starting pretty much immediately from the point at which they know this would be really happening. They said they'd have to go to the highest spending agencies, and that for them is public safety, which would be police and other first responders, fire department, schools, education, and human services. And human services includes assistance programs for the city's poorest residents, programs to address homelessness. They basically said that these cuts would be sweeping and would affect a lot of important city services across the board.
Is there a way to make folks in other states care about our budget and nag their representatives for us since we don't have our own?
Yeah, I mean, I heard a lot of folks last week in Senate offices trying to sort of make this case to people who are from other states. And obviously they were in some cases appealing to staffers who live in DC. But what I heard some of them talking about was, if they're in the office of a senator for a certain state, they might ask them, how would you feel if X city in your state or your state capital was told to suddenly cut $1 billion from their budget, even though they have an autonomous mayor and city council who have been elected to make these decisions on behalf of their residents. I think that is sort of the strongest kind of parallel that I saw people making in an effort to sort of get people who maybe are less familiar with the district to understand what this means for people here.
That makes a lot of sense. That's a good way to approach it, I think. As we enter our annual budget season, Bowser was set to unveil her 2026 fiscal year proposal just in a few weeks. What do we know about how she's now approaching that in light of what's been happening the last few weeks?
Yeah, I mean, she has said they are still preparing to unveil that budget. And that budget was already going to be tough for the city. Lee, the city's chief financial officer, he is predicting a downward revenue projections over the next few years to the tune of about $1 billion. And so Bowser's team has been spending the last so odd months trying to put together a budget that will likely include cuts, although they have not disclosed where those cuts would be. But we're preparing to see that in 2 weeks, and they are still proceeding with that budget as planned.
And I mean, to that end, this is a continuing resolution, so it only satisfies things until September. So you and I and Jenny might be having this conversation again in September. How are DC leaders thinking ahead about how they can prevent another week of panic come September?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is the nature of DC, right? Because the city sits under Congress's thumb, essentially, and Congress has pretty much exclusive authority over the city and its affairs. At any time, they could choose to do something like this again. I don't want to speak for DC officials, but I think they're very aware of this reality, and I imagine they would just use the same tools that they've been using this time around, reaching out to the offices where they have relationships. Bowser has a good relationship with James Comer, who chairs the House Oversight Committee that sits over DC affairs. The two of them have a good relationship, and she communicates with his office regularly. So I would imagine they would just use the tools they have at their disposal. But it's true that because of the nature of the relationship between DC and Congress, that it's possible we could be here again at some point.
Well, we'll have to have you back in September. Jenny, thank you so much for covering all this and for being here.
Thanks so much for having me, Bridget.
That's all for today here on CityCast DC. If you went down to the Hill last week to lobby, thank you for fighting for DC. We'll be following the House vote very closely, so forward this episode to your friends who might not know the critical impasse DC is at. We'll be back tomorrow morning with even more news from around the city. Talk to you then.